This is Chapter 4 of The Americans, The Union in Peril, Part 2. In this video, we'll cover Sections 3 and 4. In Section 4.3, you will read about how the North takes charge. The main idea of this section is that after 4 years of bloody fighting, the Union wore down the Confederacy and won the war. On page 176, you'll read about the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most important battles of the war because it was an offensive invasion by the South into Northern territory. It was a defeat of the South in which most of the best forces the South had to offer were destroyed. And it was the turning of the tide of the war in favor of the Union. On page 177, you'll read about the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, which produced staggering losses for all sides. 23,000 Union men and 28,000 Confederate soldiers were killed or wounded. Total casualties were more than 30%. However, this is seen as one of the greatest victories of the Union Army during the war. On page 177, you'll also find the Gettysburg Address. This is one of the most important speeches in American history, given by Abraham Lincoln to commemorate the founding of a cemetery honoring those that had died at the Battle of Gettysburg. The Gettysburg Address has been said to be a remaking of America. In many ways, it was a refounding of our country. Abraham Lincoln not only honored those who died at Gettysburg, but he gave a new mission and a new purpose for the American people, understanding the role of their government in a new way. Very famously, he said in his speech that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. It is important to understand that the Gettysburg Address answered the question of states' rights and federal power that was being fought during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln essentially answers this debate by giving the federal government the power to override any state at any time. This is a reinterpretation of government that has differed from the Founding Fathers' desire to maintain states' rights. On page 178, you'll see a section that describes history through photojournalism. The photograph was a new invention during this time period and was used by journalists like Matthew Brady to record the suffering and tragedy of war. No longer was war to be understood as something glorious and heroic. Now Americans and everyone else could see the tragedy, horrors, and suffering that war brought to the common man. The Battle of Vicksburg was a very important success for the Union Army because it gave them complete control over the Mississippi River. This essentially gave the Union total control over all water access to the South. After the victory at Vicksburg, the South was completely surrounded, and it was just a matter of time before the North could starve out the South. After the Union victory at Vicksburg and total surrounding of the South, we'll be able to observe a new type of warfare called total war. On page 180, you'll read how the Confederacy was worn down by total war. Total war was conducted by Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman as they burnt down every civilian facility in the South. Total war meant that no longer was war confined only to the battlefield between professionally trained armies. Total war meant now that innocent civilians, men, women, children, and civilian institutions like hospitals, churches, and homes could all be considered military targets. This is the American contribution to modern warfare. Notice at the bottom of page 180 where it details Sherman's march. Starting in 1864, Sherman began his march through Georgia to the sea, creating a wide path of destruction. His army burned almost every house in its path and destroyed livestock and railroads. On page 181, you will see the end of the Civil War, in which Lincoln is re-elected in the election of 1864, despite the fact that most Americans were not participating in the election. Also, you'll see the surrender of Robert E. Lee at the courthouse of Appomattox. The painting down below shows the signing of the surrender at Appomattox. Page 182 shows how the war plays out politically, economically, and socially. On this page, you'll see the political and economic changes that resulted from the Civil War. Essentially, the debate over the slave economy and the free economy was answered in favor of the free economy, and slavery was ultimately done away with. The 13th Amendment is passed as the institution of slavery is outlawed forever. On page 183, we see the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and a photograph showing Abraham Lincoln's body lying in a casket. Please note the assassin's name was John Wilkes Booth, a 26-year-old actor and Southern sympathizer who killed Lincoln while he was attending the theater on April 14th, 1865. At the end of chapter 4.3, you'll find the vocabulary listed here for this section. Please add them to your growing lists of vocabulary cards. Chapter 4, Section 4, Reconstruction and its Effects. After the Civil War, the nation embarked on a period known as Reconstruction, during which attempts were made to readmit the South to the Union. As we examine this section, we need to ask ourselves, what is the true meaning of Reconstruction? If the definition of the term means to rebuild or restore something to which it had previously been, we need to ask ourselves, to what are we restoring the country? Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction made it clear that he favored a very lenient policy. Lincoln wanted amnesty for all of the Southerners who had fought against the Union. And he came up with something called the 10% Plan, which would allow states to re-enter the Union after being in rebellion if only 10% of the population swore an oath of allegiance to the Union. We have to ask ourselves about the 10% Plan, whether or not it could be considered democratic or effective. If only 10% of the people in any state swear loyalty to our country, can we consider that state truly loyal? Also, if only 10% of the people in any state are loyal to our country, can we consider their admission to our nation democratic? On page 185, you'll see a term describing the Radical Republicans that were led by Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. The Radical Republicans proved to be the thorn in the side of the new president, Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president and became president after Lincoln's assassination, announced he had different plans for Reconstruction. The Radical Republicans fought him every step of the way. The reason the Radical Republicans differed with Andrew Johnson on Reconstruction was that Andrew Johnson was very, very favorable to the Confederate States. Andrew Johnson also opposed Congress's actions to help the freed slaves after the Civil War. Congress voted to enlarge the Freedmen's Bureau and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. These laws gave African Americans citizenship and forbade states from passing discriminatory laws, also known as Black Codes. The Black Codes restricted African Americans' lives and made their freedom truly suspect. On page 186, you'll read how the conflict between the Radical Republicans in Congress and President Andrew Johnson ultimately led to Johnson's impeachment. Johnson had removed a cabinet member, and this violated the Tenure of Office Act, which stated that a president could not remove cabinet members, and therefore the House impeached Andrew Johnson. However, impeachment requires conviction in the Senate, and the Senate would not vote to convict him. He was spared true impeachment by just one vote. The radical Republicans introduced the 15th Amendment during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. The 15th Amendment states that no one can be kept from voting because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In the section entitled Reconstructing Society, you'll read about how the South was rebuilt with massive amounts of assistance from the federal government. Politics in the post-war South introduced us to two new terms, scalawags and carpetbaggers. Scalawags were white Southerners who joined the Republican Party. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved to the South after the war. Because of the gains they enjoyed after the Civil War, African Americans voted for the first time, and in many places, African Americans actually held political office. Hiram Revels is the first African American elected to the United States Senate. Despite new political power, African Americans will continue to suffer economically. Under the system of sharecropping, African Americans will be assigned a few acres of land which they will not own, and they will borrow money from the landowners to buy seeds and tools. The idea was that the sharecroppers would keep a small share of their crops and give the rest to the landowners. However, in reality, this system kept African Americans in a state of economic servitude or economic slavery. While they weren't slaves by name, essentially African Americans continued to suffer as slaves would have. We have to ask ourselves, when we consider Reconstruction, just what has been changed. While African Americans like Hiram Revels will achieve high political office for the first time, all of these political gains will disappear after 1877. Also, economically, while African Americans are no longer property, they do not have any economic power and suffer as slaves under the system of sharecropping. The collapse of Reconstruction is discussed in this section here. We've already detailed how political gains will be lost after Reconstruction and how economic gains were never truly possible for African Americans. Socially, however, opposition to Reconstruction takes shape in the form of the Ku Klux Klan, a vigilante group formed in the South by former Confederate soldiers. The KKK, as they were known, stands even now as the largest terrorist organization to ever exist in the United States. Despite all efforts to preserve the gains of Reconstruction, the passage of the Amnesty Act in 1872 gave the right to vote back to all the former Confederates. This meant that all of the gains that had been brought by federal control over the South after the Civil War would be undone by the very Confederates who had fought against us on the battlefield. Democrats who had taken back political office from Republicans in the South redeemed the South by undoing all of the gains of Reconstruction. The word redeem is in quotations here because they're not making it better, they're returning the South to the inequality and racism that had ruled it during the Civil War. At the end of Reconstruction, we have to ask ourselves just how successful it really was. We have the passage of important amendments to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. We have the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, and we also have the freedom of the slave. But, on the other hand, we also have a return to servitude through sharecropping. We have the loss of political power for African Americans, and the passage of laws called the Black Codes that make it legal for African Americans to be kept in second-class status. And lastly, we have the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, one of the large... Down here at the bottom of page 189, please notice all of the vocabulary for this section. Please add these vocabulary words to your growing list of vocabulary cards.